16 of the Potomac RPG podcast. Little does my patron know, I actually enjoy all the violence and bloodshed.
Welcome one and all to the Potomac RPG podcast, the strange pageantry of misfits, magic, and mayhem. I'm your host and unexpected extra eye, Adam.
I'm your devouring maw on a diet, Matt.
And I'm your ambiguously sentient weapon, Steve.
Oh, guys, this is going to be an interesting topic today. We have been moving through the different classes of D&D, just kind of, here and there. We started off with Rogue, and when it comes to edginess in D&D, it doesn't get much sharper than the Warlock class. Pacts with dark entities and all that. You can't help but imagine someone dressed in all black and murdering people left and right. So, Steve, you've played a Warlock before. What is so enticing about playing one?
Well, the thing about Warlocks is that they seem to come baked in with a lot of great roleplay. And unlike some of the other classes that do like a paladin with their oath, even a cleric with a particular deity and domain, the Warlock has a lot of room to stretch your arms. You can kind of figure out whatever sort of patron, you and your DM are interested in having you portray, and then you get to kind of put that in the hands of your DM and see what sort of fantastic chaos they can cause with it down the line. It's just ripe for storytelling.
That definitely has some interesting elements that it throws into the mix. Matt, I don't know. Have you played a
No, I haven't
before?
actually played a Warlock yet, but having seen, in our own games and looking over the rules, I think Steve, hit the nail on the head there, that the Warlock has a lot of flexibility in terms of where you can go with the character in terms of story. And even the way you can build the character is kind of flexible. They're kind of set as this kind of middle of the road type of character. Like, yeah, they're spellcasters, but they're not, pencil-necked wizards. They're not really warriors, but they can, kind of maybe take a few hits. So depending on how you develop them, you can fit them into different roles, and that sort of complements all the different pacts they can make in the different ways you can RP them. So I think really the Warlock has a lot of flexibility going for it, both mechanically and thematically.
Yeah, I'm really interested in today's episode because I've never played a Warlock before, and honestly, I've always shied away just because that kind of edginess, nothing really appealed to me. So I'm hoping the two of you can pull out some things in it that makes me really want to play a Warlock, and we'll get into that right now with the first question. The first post that we have today comes from Reddit user Fallen Angel, who asks,
"Ooh, edgy.
Yeah. Can a Warlock who really had no idea of what they were getting into be a thing?" So I'm honestly new to this and wanted to create a Warlock, but didn't want to go to the typical I am dying and make a deal, nor I want power and make a deal, nor I want revenge and make a deal. So I tried to make something a bit more original. Don't know if it really is that original though, but didn't know if it could really be a thing. So here it goes. In short, Warlock's mother loses her job due to being found stealing. Warlock's mother needs money. Warlock's mother makes a deal with a demon for a lifetime of riches in exchange for her firstborn child. Sometime later, Warlock's mother gets married and has a son. 12 years later, the demon comes back for the child who, encouraged by his mother for all these years, makes a deal with the demon with no idea of what he's getting into. Kid becomes a Warlock. Years later, he realizes the truth behind the gravity of his situation. It was probably thought before, but is this a valid way to be a Warlock or no? Now, Matt, I wanted to start with this question because it spoke to a specific issue I've always had with Warlocks. The pact always just seemed so cliche to me. So what do you think about Fallen Angel's planned background here, and what do you think of the pacts that people choose for their Warlocks in general?
Okay, well, first I would say there's no wrong way to do it. I mean, this is fine. I mean, I think there's kind of a moral question here about how binding a pact that a 12-year-old enters into, but hey, you can get a lot of story out of that. But I think people get sort of hung up on the idea of the pact. I think people see that and they kind of think of it like it's a contract signed in blood, right? But I think there's other ways to kind of play it. For example, if looking back over fairy tales, I mean, I think you can draw a lot of inspiration from traditional fairy tales. I mean, sometimes it might be something as simple, as an agreement that maybe had unintended consequences. Like here, the mother knowingly makes a pact for her firstborn child, but maybe it could be trickery in a fairy or devil's word. It's like, well, the first thing you see when you return home, right? That's a classic one. The person returns home and their wife has, oh, look at our newborn son. And so then the child gets roped into it sort of through no action of their own. Alternatively, the entity supplying the pact doesn't necessarily need to be something malevolent, or even if it is, not something that has malevolent intentions towards its followers.
Right. You've got a celestial pact warlock. Nothing really malevolent in a celestial, at least rules is written.
Right, right. But even you could have, it could be a small god, right? I mean, let's not limit ourselves to what's necessarily listed by word, in the rule book. I mean, it could be a fairy, it could be a magical being, it could be the local god of the harvest or something like that, right? And it may ask things in exchange from the local villagers, but they may not. They may be strange. They may ask, oh, eat this animal or don't eat this animal, or always sit facing this way. I'm thinking of a lot of the Wu Gen restrictions in prior editions. I think
Matt, I want to take one small bit of umbrage is probably not the right word, but I want to debate you on something here. See, I disagree with the notion of a warlock patron being any sort of deity. I think it steps too far on the cleric, and it makes the cleric, which is the original gangster, the OG, as it were, of connections with otherworldly entities, and it really sort of takes them out of their place. If any god can just make I've got these clerics and they spend their time praying to me and they get divine power from me, but I'm gonna have a really close one-on-one personal relationship with you, Mr. Warlock. I feel like it just really steps on the cleric's whole thing. I think, from my perspective, and where I think Warlock started off, and I'm even thinking back to going all the way back to third edition. If you remember, Matt, you probably saw the Tome of Shadows where
yes, yeah, I remember.
the binder comes from, which is where a lot of this whole sort of idea of what the warlock is in fifth edition, a lot of that comes from there. And the idea was that these are things that are they're not regular, they're not entities that you're just going to run into in your adventures typically, but they're also not deities. There's something in between. There's something about them that has this sort of power.
Well, that was what I meant. So I said small god, right?
Sure.
When I say that, I don't mean a deity in the D&D sense, but I mean, kind of like maybe a kami in the Japanese sense,
local spirit.
Right? Yeah, the local spirit, right? I mean, it's a god, but not a god, right? I mean, it's something that may be worshipped, but it doesn't necessarily have domains or spheres or a palace on Mount Celestia or in the Hells.
Or if you're a great old one, it just doesn't care about you.
Or it doesn't care too much, having worshippers, right? So I just think there's a lot of ways to play it. Like, I don't think
100%.
I don't think it's something that needs to be very rigid. All right, you sign this contract here in blood. Like, I think it could be different than that, and I think it doesn't necessarily. The atmosphere of it should sort of suit kind of what the entity is and what its relationship is with the person or people that it interacts with. So I think there's a lot of room for expanding how you come by a pact.
Yeah, and I think this actually kind of opens my eyes up a little bit, and I'm not sure how many other players out there that are a little bit new to this. My assumption with the Warlock has always been that the pact that you make with the entity, that the entity themselves are evil in nature, or bad, or will make you do bad things. Is that Is that not the case?
That's definitely not the case. I mean, so think about, and I know we've got a question later on that might sort of talk to some of the various types of pacts that are out there. But you think about it, you've got the Pact of the Fiend. That's the one that's in the basic rules, and that's where the prototypical I made a deal with the devil, right? But even in the core rules, it points out that you don't have to be evil to make a deal with a fiend necessarily. So it can be a complicated and fraught relationship. But then you've got the Great Old One, which is sort of riffing on that sort of Cthulhu vibe. Can be flavored a lot of different ways, but that's really sort of lacking in a specific alignment per se. You've got the Archfey, and the Archfey, I think probably leans more towards just being chaotic and could be evil, neutral, or good. If you look at thinking about the Feywild and the types of entities that would exist there in stories about Fey and folklore, there's room for good, and there's room for evil, and there's room for something that doesn't really care about either. And then you've got the Hexblade is just dripping with edge, but not much in the way of a specific alignment or requirement to do sort of evil acts. You've got the Undying, which is sort of the bastard child of the subclasses that no one loves, and that's about sort of unnatural extending your life, which you could flavor a lot of different ways, though tends towards darker entities. But then you've got, I think, the most obvious example that cuts counter, and this is what Anthony's using now with Luck in my game, is the Pact of the Celestial. And that's the Warlock subclass that gives you access to cleric spells, gives you healing, gives you access to like Sacred Flame and things like that. And it's very much flavored as a holy pact. I think in the Unearthed Arcana, when it first came out, they changed it a bit, but it was originally called the Pact of the Undying Light. And so it had even another sort of way of framing the sort of, it's this holy, this sort of light, but not it's not necessarily it's Lathander that I serve or something like that. It's the idea is maybe you serve some sort of very powerful entity like a Solar or a Deva or something like that. So that one very, very much is sort of cuts against the grain of the evil sort of or edgelord kind of stuff. And Warlock is really, it's the design of the class that makes it so that it's really one of the most flexible classes in terms of mechanics, as Matt pointed out, and as we're talking about now, story-wise. You can really do just about anything with a Warlock. It's just playing through that fantasy of having some sort of being that's more powerful than the ordinary and is personally interested in your character, whether from a very, very remote distance or somewhat up close, and sort of they reflect having strange and unusual powers because of it.
Yeah, it kind of brings up two questions in my mind. Number one, I know I'm not the brightest bulb in the bunch, but I wonder how many other people have not played a Warlock because they had that wrong assumption that, Warlock is evil based, or I'm going to be beholden to some evil entity. And number two, I kind of question for you here, Matt, like, doesn't that give the DM an extraordinary amount of power over your character?
Well, I think the DM always has an extraordinary amount of power over your characters, right? Rocks fall, everyone dies. I mean, when you're trying to play a game where the characters' mechanics and theme are tied to the story to some extent, or tied to the setting, of course you're giving power to the DM, but that's what role playing is. I mean, when you play an RPG, you're making a story together, so you have to trust your DM to some extent that they're going to develop the entity and the character and the relationship, and that you're going to be along for the ride and make your decisions with it and move it. So I mean, obviously, if you're playing, if you're trying to play kind of a a dungeon crawl where the DM is very much adversarial, and then you don't have a group that works that well story wise, then I can see running into trouble. But that's a deeper problem than just the class you picked. I mean, that's a group problem. So I think in any functional group, the fact that you are dependent on the DM for for your patrons, wishes or requirements or whatever isn't a bad thing. I think as long as your group is functional, I think that can be a very good thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know we got off track a little bit from Fallen Angel's question, but yeah, I think the consensus that we have, if I'm not mistaken, is that of course this is valid. That this is, absolutely. I think that's an interesting background, and how this kid kind of, as he finds out that he's a warlock to this, demon, how they deal with that, I think would be interesting. You guys agree on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a
I
great
don't.
setup to create a character that embraces those dark powers, but maybe doesn't have the same dark intent and alignment. It makes for a perfect anti-hero style
There you
character,
go.
throwing hellfire back at the forces of evil. I dig it.
Absolutely.
Edgy.
So, Fallen Angel, I hope that helps a little bit. I know we got off on a tangent, but would love to hear how your Warlock character comes along as you play it.
I have news here.
Oh, and the sound of Ralphie the News Goblin can mean only one thing. It is time for Potomac RPG News. Ralphie! All right, got a double shot of news for you today. First is the most obvious one. As most people know, Wizards of the Coast released a new Unearthed Arcana that added Warlock and Bard subclasses to the mix. Some interesting stuff in here and plenty for us to dig into. So, Steve, going to turn to you first. Looking at the Warlock subclasses, what's jumping out to you?
So I mentioned earlier the unloved bastard stepchild of the Warlock subclasses being the Undying. And what's really cool about what Wizards has done with this new Unearthed Arcana is I think they've basically said, we're going to take a mulligan. We're not going to delete what's already there. It seems like they're unwilling to remove stuff as an option, which makes sense. Someone bought the book. And they've created a new undead patron, which seems to sort of take another crack at the same sort of fantasy of serving, having your patron be, some sort of being of undeath. And, they list like potential patrons being like Strahd or Asliel or whatever the lich's name is.
It's Alan.
And thank you. And just bring some really, really cool flavor to the Warlock. And I think does a better job of being a mechanically interesting, if slightly overpowered take on this sort of Warlock with the dread form. I love it. I think it's really exciting. I'd love to see one sometime in the future that really sort of takes us away from the realm of fiends and celestials and gets to some of that good old undead vampires, zombies, and everything else.
Well, Matt, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good that they essentially redid the Undying. I mean, some of the class features are maybe a little overpowered. I mean, I don't know. This is a playtest. This is playtest material, so it's probably going to be rebalanced. But I mean, some of the things they can do are pretty good. Like a grave touched is like, well, this thing's resistant to physical damage, resistant to necrotic damage. I mean, that is potentially fairly powerful. I'm not sure how it works in actual play. So I think there's probably going to be a little bit of rebalancing with it, but I think it's good that they. I mean, I think more patrons are always a good thing.
Yeah, and you got to come in strong, right? I mean, they've done a lot of bringing things out, and they're usually overpowered a little bit, and they'll fine tune them based on feedback from all the players out there. But I think it's better to start off with a slightly stronger subclass, and then you're able to kind of pare it down. Mm-hmm. Whereas it's a lot harder to balance out if you have something pretty underpowered, and then try to bring that back up to a level that it's competitive with the rest of the classes later. At least guarantees you're going through another round of revisions and test play, hopefully, before you put it in the book. So.
Yeah, I mean, I got to admit, like I'm looking at this and considering my questions from before, you can kind of predict what I'm thinking here. Like this just, I know warlocks are normally with demons and fiends and all that, but this just is like, all right, you're gonna have 20,000, edgelords playing this for sure. Like it feels like okay, yeah, it's dark and it's, blah blah blah, and, undead, and it's just not very interesting to me. I'm sorry, it's just not tickling an itch. But that's just me. I understand there's a lot of people out there who are completely into this stuff. In terms of the powers, Steve, Matt, you certainly have a better understanding of that. But just flavor wise, I'm not feeling it as much. I don't know why. It just doesn't. It doesn't pique my interest at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's just different styles for everyone. I mean, I think there's some really interesting ways you can go. With everything in D&D, it kind of gets a little boring when you just sort of take it, rules as written, and you're just sort of playing sort of the cookie cutter interpretation of any of these patrons. And I think what gets really interesting is when you start thinking about the patron as sort of the base of the template, and you kind of work on it from there. I haven't had a lot of time to noodle through really interesting ideas about the undead patron, but I'm thinking even something like a celestial patron, just kind of going back to that, right? You could play that very much like, oh, I'm a holy servant doing this. Well, what if your celestial patron is the patron for a character that is of ambiguous morality? So you're not necessarily, you're not the lawful good
Sure.
paladin running around with a few warlock levels on there to boost your power, but instead you're like this sort of badass that can get things done. And here's this deva coming by. A god would never, a lawful or some sort of celestial god would never truck with an individual like this. But this is a creature that's below that pay grade and just needs to get things done. And so, yeah, you know what? I'm going to parcel off a bit of my power to this guy over here so that he can get these things done. Now you've created this interesting tension between maybe the means that this character is going to have to fulfill these ends, and there's sort of a push and pull with the patron, and it's all about taking the material and kind of spinning it a a little bit on its head. If you play it just straight as written, it gets boring fast. Yeah. But that's because that's sort of the base, and it comes down to layering on interesting characters. I mean, most of the classes by themselves don't have a lot of just like, okay, you're a wizard, great. Well, what does that mean? Like, you need to put something more into it. I'm thinking about your character in our other campaign that is taking on this sort of these mastermind rogue levels and playing them in a really sort of interesting fashion. The class in and of itself, I mean, it's very somewhat one note, but it's all about the particular personality and background. So I think if you took some time, if you were like, I want to mechanically try a warlock, I'm willing to bet you would start to find some really interesting ways to spin that character. Though, admittedly, there's going to be some things that spike our curiosity and interest a lot easier than others, and that might just be that warlocks aren't yours.
I do like this idea of conflict within a character, and I think in all D&D characters that you play, like if you have some kind of conflict within that character, that's great, and this kind of brings that to the forefront. And I love the idea of spinning that, where the norm is that the entity wants you to do something bad, but you're good and you don't want to do it, and oh goodness, what do I do? Flipping that on its head and saying, I want to do bad, but my celestial entity wants me to do good, I think is a really interesting way of looking at it. I think I'd have a lot of fun with that kind of character. So that's a great idea. So, hey, with the undead pact, I mean, I'm sure it looks interesting to a lot of people. We'll see where it goes. Always good to have another subclass to choose from. So if you're interested, check it out. Wizards has it up on their website. You can take a look for yourself. Now, the second news item that I want to get into, it's unrelated, but still pretty cool tidbit here. As reported by Amy Ratcliffe at the Nerdist, Manticore Games has opened a contest to design a dungeon in this software called Core. It's a user-generated content platform where people can create and play their own games. So there's 4 different themes that'll be judged: strongholds, the wilderness, elemental planes, and dungeon. And there's a $20,000 prize pool to be shared amongst the 4 winners. Not a bad purse. Now, I was a little disappointed because when I first read it, it said $20,000 prize. I was like, oh, that'd be awesome. But then you split it 4 ways, still great, but not quite as juicy as it once was. Interesting stuff here, though. If you have some computer skills and want to give it a shot, seems to be worth it. The bigger question that I have with this Core game, like, it's almost like designing a world within Neverwinter Nights, from what I can tell. Like I'm not quite sure, how much use it'll get in terms of true D&D, because we've been down this road before. It's really hard to incorporate the things of D&D and make it feel like D&D in a game, because there is so much going on outside of the fighting. So do you guys think there's a place for role-playing D&D within a game setting like this?
So I think it's good for a certain kind of game. I mean, I think that sometimes you just need a generic dungeon or a generic forest or something like that. And I think for this type of thing is probably pretty good for that. I think as a campaign it gets very specific, and you're doing the stronghold of the Mad Overlord, and is all loaded with plot stuff. Then it gets a little bit harder to adapt. So I think there's a place for it, but I don't think it can fully replace a written campaign.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, and I'm not too familiar with the core platform, so I'm not sure exactly how it works. But yeah, how is this not just like WoW? Or some other, action RPG, MMO out there. Like, I don't understand. I understand the design part of it. Yeah, you make something look really cool, but like, it's not talking about the more internal elements that make D&D what it is. So, I mean, hey, it's a great prize if you're really into building worlds, like in a video game type setting. This is perfect. I don't really understand. Yeah, my only guess is that Dungeons and Dragons is kind of looking at this a little like kind of reading the tea leaves a little bit, because right now we are in quarantine still. Well, we should be. Everybody should be still distancing and wearing a mask, please, for the love of God. But like, so the role of online play with video is not going to go away anytime soon. And I wonder if this is them kind of propping that medium up because they foresee it as being such a large chunk. Who knows when we're going to be able to get back around the table again,
Absolutely. I mean, and even when we're able to get back around a table again, how many people are going to find the convenience of playing digitally? I mean, already lots of people were playing digitally before, but those who were sort of sticking on to playing in person, I mean, how much more convenient might it be for them to play online versus playing in person? So I'm sure there's some parties that I'm certainly damn well excited to get back to the table, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
but
me too.
I'm sure there's plenty of parties out there that have adapted in interesting ways and aren't necessarily going to want to go back to the way things were before. They may have welcomed new players in that they couldn't have welcomed in before because of the fact that they're playing online and that. And there's going to be a space for that, and it's only going to get bigger. I'd be interested to see where we sit a few years from now. I think having especially here in the U.S. where this thing's just going and going and going. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some long-term cultural shifts in how a lot of people anyways approach doing things in large groups and gathering and all that. So it'll be interesting to see how that impacts the game.
Yeah, well, if you're interested, check it out. I'll have the link in the show notes. Make some money. Yeah, why not, right? So, but $20,000, not a bad prize purse. And so check that out. Or if you want to look at the Nerdist article, that was Dungeons & Dragons Design a Dungeon Contest. So we're going to step out for a moment, but stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break.
As any tabletop role player would know, coffee is an essential commodity for those 4-hour sessions we all go through. And a great place to get that coffee is foundfamiliar.com. Found Familiar is a couple of people with a passion for coffee creation and D&D. And they've teamed up with favorite artists from all around the world to bring specialty grade coffee that celebrates the creativity sparked by Dungeons & Dragons and other TTRPGs. Use the coupon code Potomac RPG, all one word, at checkout for 10% discount on your purchase. That's at foundfamiliar.com. And with that, let's get back to the show.
All right, how about another question? This comes from Reddit user A Noob in Disguise, who asks, convince me to make my warlock not a hexblade. I'm having difficulty finding a reason to play a non-hexblade warlock. That's mainly because hexblades, to me, seem to be so much better than all the other warlock subclasses. Disclaimer, I have never played a full campaign of D&D. I have played a one-shot with friends once, but am only now looking to join a real play group, and I'm trying to come up with a character. So my impressions of classes and mechanics are primarily theoretical and from a newbie's perspective, but I'm pretty sure warlock is my favorite class on paper. That was what I played during the one shot, and I enjoyed it then. I'm mostly looking at this from a power gaming perspective. I prefer to create an optimized character first and then justify them with roleplay / backstory when playing RPGs. They're relatively durable compared to most warlock classes. Getting a shield and medium armor lets me soft cap my dex at 14, giving me an easy 18 AC at level 1. Compare that to other warlocks who have 13 to 14 at the same level and are required to invest more character points into dex for durability, compared to the hexblade who can focus solely on charisma and constitution. Being durable is important to me, and I understand that level 1 combat is a crapshoot at best, so having that extra AC early is way better than eventually taking moderately armored or subclassing paladin or something. Hexblade gets an awesome early ability. Hexblade's Curse looks very good. Hexblade also gets what looks like a pretty good ability at level 6, with the ability to get an ally at little extra cost. Most Warlock subclasses seem to have to wait until 10 or 14 to get useful abilities, and it's not really a given that you'll reach those levels in a level 1 campaign. I'd rather be as powerful as possible early instead of limiting myself for the promise of power later. Lastly, RP. Hexblade suffers from a lack of clear flavor, and the kind of character I want to play wouldn't actually pick up a weapon, but Hexblades don't really have anything to do with weapons inherently despite their name. The patron of Hexblades is also really unclear. Is just some sort of godly weaponsmith from the Shadowfell? Or is it a magic sword? I don't know. But on the other hand, I could see a Drow ancestry half-elf, which my planned character will be, making a pact with a Shadowfell entity for power. But the Hexblade patron is way more nebulous and vague than the Devil, Celestial, Old One, etc. And I like the flavor of most patrons more than the Hexblade patron due to its nebulousness. But I don't want to sacrifice all those good numbers. Thoughts? Okay, that was a long one. Matt, Hexblade Warlock is one of those things that it seems everyone takes, kind of like Totem Barbarian. So how can you convince Noob to not go Hexblade?
Wow. Okay. So first, I tip my hat to his analysis of the class abilities. There's a reason people dip 1 or 2 levels, and often in Hexblade, and he hit the nail on the head right there. I think the Hexblade is extremely good at the role it's made for, which is the Gish role. I mean, if I'm using an old term here, but really the kind of magical warrior, fighter mage type of character. I think the Hexblade mechanically is really good at that. And so if that's the role you want to do, the only way I would argue against that is try actually different character classes that can also do that. There's subclasses of Bard that can do it, and Eldritch Knight can do it. But I think in terms of the Warlock, you can make a Warlock that's also really powerful in different roles. Like I think, for example, the Celestial Warlock is really great as a caster blaster type. And you or a charm type for the archer. I think you can be powerful if you're willing to go other roles. But if you want to play the Gish, I think the Warlock, at least with the current patrons, is very much locked into the Hexblade. I mean, from the RP perspective, and maybe Steve actually has experience with this type of character. It's the lore of the Hexblade patron is very much tied to sort of the Forgotten Realms setting theology. I think maybe Steve can address that better.
It's awful. The Hexblade is awful. The Hexblade really should have just been rolled into the Pact of the Blade so that Pact of the Blade is actually a viable choice for any one of these warlocks. That the reason why the Hexblade Warlock has no real patron flavor is because it shouldn't be a patron of its own. You go and read it, and that was, back in the intro, your ambiguously sentient sword. That's what I'm talking about. What is the Hexblade patron? Is it a magical sword? Is it the Raven Queen? Why does the Raven Queen care about magical swords? Doesn't make any sense to me, but she's a mysterious entity, so I guess you can glom it in there. The Hexblade should have been more about hexing and cursing, which it has some great abilities for, and they should have taken some of this chunky, make you really great at melee combat stuff out of the subclass. But they wrote it as it is. So what are you going to do?
Historically, if I remember correctly, in 3rd edition or 3.5, there was actually a Hexblade class that was a fighter mage cast that did cursing.
That's right.
Yeah,
exactly. And that was a killer class. It had sort of a roguey, fightery, wizardy element to it. I actually remember that class really well. I can picture the concept art from the book in my mind. And this is not a lot like that. There was not, but be that as it may, I don't want to get too far afield here. Look, if you're going to play and you're playing for, I want to build a super powerful character and then I'm going to, roll out the story behind it. Yeah, sure. This is a great choice. But I got to say, this is someone who's, you didn't ask for advice about this, but this is someone who's coming to their first game, and their core focus is, I want to make sure I'm the most powerful, my numbers are the highest, and I don't want to wait to get my power. I just want to be powerful out of the gate, and that's all well and good, and that could be the type of game that this player is going into, where everyone's just really focused on an optimized build, and the DM is going to challenge them accordingly. But I really got to say, sit back and think about some of the thematics. What is the role you're going to play in the group? What does the group consist of? If you've already got people who are handling the melee roles, do you really need to have yet another character who's sort of running up in melee when a warlock could do so many more interesting things? I mean, I've played around with an Archfey warlock. The charming and frightening people and all this kind of stuff is really, really cool. And you can get some of that when you're playing, say, a wizard, and especially if you're playing an enchanter. But there's so many more things that a wizard can do. They're sort of toolboxes, filled with so many pieces that it's harder to sort of zero in and focus on that sort of gimmick like the warlock is. And that's, at the core for me, like, warlock is a spellcaster that gets to focus on their gimmick. They only have a few spells, they refresh really quickly on short rests, and they get some neat sort of powers that sort of play into that. And so that's where they really shine. And with the Hexblade, I feel like you kind of lose a little bit of that. You just really become like, I don't know, I'm a moody paladin. I even can get Eldritch Smite and stuff like that. And look, I say that when I've theory crafted a bunch of great builds with interesting character story, or at least I feel are interesting character stories that would take advantage of these. And my original character for Anthony's first campaign, when we all started playing together, was actually a Hexblade. But Nick had already made one, and I just swore up a storm and made something else. I wouldn't want to play this. So, there's definitely some cool stuff to it, but just having spent enough time looking at it, the Hexblade just suffers for good story. I'm sure you can talk to your DM and make a cool patron aspect of it. I don't think that any DM is going to want to restrict you to say, well, you're playing a Hexblade, so I'm going to force you to have really subpar lore for your patron, and it's a talking sword or something like that. But the one other thing I'll say is that
Stormbringer,
playing it well, and playing a Hexblade when you're a character that's never even going to pick up a weapon. What's the point? So are you playing that because the player just wants to have a higher AC for their blasting work? I assume they're just going to Eldritch Blast for days because that's, pick a subclass because you want to have a little bit higher of an AC. Where's the utility there? I think, one of the biggest abilities that you're missing out on is that I'm going to be able to use my charisma for attack rolls and damage. That's a huge benefit to helping make a Hexblade be, less mad, and sort of being able to rely on their charisma. And so, if you're not even going to use that aspect of it, I feel like that's one of the strong pillars of the subclass. So then I would say, why don't take a look at what some of the other cool flavor and interesting abilities are for some of the other subclasses. But
well,
that's just me.
Yeah, I had a couple things on this. Number one, I agree with Matt that this person did their homework. You looked into it. You know what you're talking about, and if the type of game that you're playing is along these lines, that you do have to min max, that you do have, that it's going to be harsh and challenging, then more power to you. Or if that's just kind of your group feel. But this is your first one coming in, similar, like Steve said, like the thing that makes Dungeons and Dragons what it is and not a video game are the stories that are incorporated within it. So for example, Matt, your character Roxana, the paladin, we were talking about it last night. In terms of flavor, like, and background and story, Roxana really didn't have a whole lot going on, and compared to your current characters who are much more story based, and that's really kind of what is memorable about this stuff. And some of those characters, the flaws that they have, the fact that they're not min-maxed, you rarely remember how much damage that one person did that one time. You do remember when someone betrayed someone, or when there was some kind of conflict that happened, or some funny thing that somebody said. Those are the things that you kind of remember. So if you're doing this because you're nervous or fearful about being able to hold your own, that's understandable. We've all been there, but it's okay. The way that you're going to do the best is by playing a character that means something to you, that you really feel a connection with. If that is a Hexblade who's statted out and really likely to survive, great, more power to you. But if it's not, don't be afraid to go a route that's unconventional or not power game material if that's what you're feeling. So hopefully that helps. We'd love to hear how your sessions go and what you finally decide on in the end, and just kind of keep us posted on how things are going. Welcome to the hobby. It's a great hobby, and we are glad to have you. So absolutely, we're going to get into another segment here with the new subclass in the new UA. And the number of official subclasses. There's always the question of which one is best. So let's take a look at our favorite Warlock subclasses in our segment. Pick is in.
Here we go now.
Welcome to Pick is In, where we give our expert, and in my case, not so expert, top-ranked pick in whatever we're talking about. In today's episode, we'll be ranking the Warlock subclasses. So here's how it'll work. We'll each give our top pick for a Warlock subclass. Then we'll viciously defend our pick against each other, and our listeners will have the chance to vote on our Twitter poll which person they think had the best pick, or at least the best argument for it. You two ready?
Yeah,
Let's do it.
All right, let's get into it. So, Matt, I'm going to turn to you first on this. What is your top subclass for a Warlock?
So hopefully we won't pick the same one. I was going to say the Celestial, and I like this. I like the Celestial Pact because I feel like the Celestial Pact really lets you put kind of a multi-roles into one character, because the Celestial Pact gives you this ranged bonus healing, which just increases with level, and it's actually quite a bit of healing. And then at later levels, you get temporary hit points both for yourself and also for members of your party. And on top of that, they get an offensive edge with radiant and fire damage. And so in addition to their Eldritch Blast, which they can do, they also have these other offensive options. So I feel like the character can both support as both a blaster and a healer, and I think that can fulfill multiple roles in the party. And it sort of says, well, maybe that you don't need a cleric as much. You can have kind of this blasty healer type.
All right. Well, Steve, how about you? What's your top pick?
Celestial.
Shit. This is always less interesting when everyone agrees.
So the Celestial was mine because it a lot of the reasons Matt said, it really opens up the Warlock to playing sort of multiple roles, and still I think doing a pretty good job of it. The extra spell list is great, the healing's great, the ability to try to make Sacred Flame somewhat usable cantrip next to Eldritch Blast. I kind of appreciated the effort there, though I think they kind of fell a little short. But let's not go back through what makes Celestial great. So I'm just gonna reach into my bag of tricks and pull out an argument for something that's not yet seen official print and has yet to really see use in any of our games. That's the genie.
Yeah, I was looking at that.
Yeah.
What's really cool about this, and this is all about the sort of design pillars for warlocks. So, I don't want to get too far on a tangent here, but the reason why warlocks are so interesting and also sort of a pain, I think, is that they have this weird set where you get sort of two pivot choices for your character. Like mostly, you're a paladin, so pick an oath. You're a rogue, pick a type of rogue that you are. You're a wizard, pick a school. You're a cleric, pick a domain. Well, with a warlock, it's pick a patron and then pick a pact, right? So what's cool, so they get sort of two sort of really deep choices. I think every class should, but that's a whole other thing. What's interesting about the genie is that it actually gives you a third choice, because when you're picking your genie patron, you have to actually pick what type of genie it is. So Dao, Djinn, Ifrit, or a Merit, and they're tied to one of the different elements. So already you can have two genie warlocks in the group, and they're actually slightly different characters, which is always cool. Character choice and meaningful choices that differentiate you from other classes is always something that I think is really cool. And the more we can see that, I think the better. I love the fact that, at first level, they're getting this genie's vessel. They give kind of a unique spellcasting focus. I love the idea of spellcasting focuses, and I dislike the fact that there doesn't really seem to be a lot of mechanical weight behind them. I mean, I know there's you can give out, here's a wand that's made of such and such type of wood, and people will get like a +1 on their damage rolls for spells or whatever, but I never see those really given out. I don't have any wizards in my game. I don't have a lot of spellcasters in my game, actually. So you rarely see those given out, and I just think there's so much more you could do with it, both thematically and mechanically. So here the genie gets a cool vessel, and this great ability to just go and vanish into their vessel. I mean, how cool is that? They get genie's wrath, so they can deal extra damage based on the type of genie that they have a pact with. They get damage resistance later on. Damage resistance is always great. They can give themselves flying speed. Then they can later by 10th level. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, just think about that, right? And then by 10th level, they could bring other people into their vessel. I mean, come on. You're just like, oh yeah, you got the tiny huts of the world, the rope tricks of the world. Well, you know what? We're going to go into my oil lamp. How great. Let's play Aladdin here. And then I think the coolest is that if you can actually manage to get yourself to a game where you're playing level 14, you can entreat your patron to grant you a small wish. I mean, that's pretty awesome. It just so thematically, I think it really nails the fantasy of playing a character who's aligned to some sort of genie-like creature, and has some really interesting mechanical abilities that are slightly different from just, well, here's a different way in which I help you deal more damage every turn. And so, because someone took my pick already, I'm going to say that the genie, well, maybe not my top. My top is probably the Celestial. I think it's one of the most interesting to bring to the table.
Yeah,
it's very thematic.
It is, and I was looking at that myself, and again, I don't have a lot of interest in warlocks and nor experience, but I will ask you this: is Ben's character Porto? Is he a lurker in the deep warlock?
He's a deep one.
Now, his gameplay specifically makes me interested in this subclass here, because he plays it so well, and especially if you're doing any kind of water-based campaign or a water-based character. He plays a pirate in the game. Very, very cool flavor to it. I don't know about the abilities. He certainly seems to be handling himself well. He killed one of us, so it's he's doing well with it. But really interesting. I don't think I'd say, hey, that's the best one out there. I'm leaning Celestial myself, but it certainly made me think twice about that lurker in the deep, just based on how well he plays it. And just to kind of go off on a bit of a tangent here, I was looking on GameRant.com, and they had a article that released from Denny Connolly about a week ago that has a breakdown of the percentage of play for the different subclasses. And the interesting thing about that, we talked about Hexblade. We expected that to be like, oh, everyone picks Hexblade. The 3 top warlock subclasses taken. In third place is the Great Old One at 9%. The Hexblade is number 2 at 16%, and at number 1 with 52% of players on D&D Beyond, the Fiend subclass, which I thought was pretty interesting. Does that surprise you guys at all?
It actually doesn't surprise me all that much for two reasons, and one is far less interesting than you'd think. Well, first of all, it's one of the originals, so there's more time for people to have built characters using that, and the Fiend is a pretty common idea. It's like sort of the base idea of the Warlock was probably with the Pact or the Fiend in mind, and then everything else was added on from there. But the less interesting answer is that that's the one that comes for free. The basic rules has a subclass for each of the classes in the game, and the Fiend I'm almost positive is the sort of the free subclass that's available for the Warlock. So if you don't have a subscription to D&D Beyond for some of the additional materials like the Player's Handbook, Xanathars, and what have you, then the only type of Warlock you could make is the Fiend Warlock.
Interesting. Okay, well, that answers the question then. So that's definitely skewing the scale, I would think. But we have enough time for one more question. We just have a few minutes left, but I want to get into it. Our last post of the week comes from Reddit user Withering Aurora, who asks, should Warlock get a rework? 5e is a team-based game, is one of its core principles. But when we get to Warlock, it is the opposite. While most don't realize, Warlock is a class that is, even if unintentionally, designed to be the opposite. Rules as written assumes 2 to 3 short rests between 7 to 8 encounters. Realistically, I've yet to see a table play that way. More often than not, having 0 short rests with 1 to 2 encounters. Typically, the situation either doesn't allow you to rest or the situation isn't time sensitive, in which case you can take a long rest. Because of it, the party can often nova during the encounters, and then either the Warlock has to be a jerk and insist for the party to push forward when he knows they expended their features, or has to give in when the party decides to call it a night and long rest. Even if the Warlock would get his short rest, he'd put himself in danger, as D&D is a team-based game. Some people say it isn't the DM's fault, and in the majority of the time, it isn't, as that is simply how the party/group plays the game. But the above is common enough to be a stereotype, so I'd like to ask you all, should Warlock get a rework? If no, I'd love to hear your reasoning. If yes, I'd love to hear it too. So, a rework. All right, Steve, what do you think? Do Warlocks need a rework?
No.
All right.
The rest of the classes need a rework. No, the rest I kind of touched on it. The rest of the classes need a rework because you really should have this design philosophy of having the 2 pillars of choice
short rest
for every single class. It makes everything more interesting.
Yep.
Matt, I'll see you floor.
So I think the issue that the poster is having is sort of a conflict between short rest, long rest classes. So the monk is also a short rest class, right? They recover their ki on short rest. Mm-hmm. Other classes are more heavily favored towards long rest, even if they have the occasional short rest ability, like wizards. So I think the issue here is maybe there's a party composition issue. Maybe it's the way they play their games, how many short rests they have. Because obviously the classes with short rest abilities are going to shine more when you have short rests. Yeah. So I don't know if that necessarily means that the Warlock needs a rework. I mean, I don't think that's the case. I think the idea behind the Warlock class is really good, and I think the options for the Warlock class are really good. I think the Warlock might need a few more pacts. I think it would be nicer if there were a few more Gish rolls, maybe. That were maybe a little bit different than the Hexblade, for example. Mm-hmm. And like Steve had mentioned, maybe it would be better if Hexblade was sort of folded into Pact of the Blade that they had. They didn't kind of, have that differentiation. But those are really minor. I mean, I think the Warlock is actually a very well-conceived class. I think that maybe some of the other classes need to have some more. The ones that don't anyway need to have some more short rest abilities to sort of bring, maybe not parity, but basically to make a short rest type adventure more viable in cases where it isn't versus a long rest adventure.
I agree with both you, and on that point, Matt, like I kind of disagree. I like the disparity between the classes in terms of the short rest versus long rest, because the DM is going to be able to use that, and that really helps those short rest characters shine while the rest of us are struggling, suddenly the monk and the warlock are kind of leading the charge and getting us out alive, and vice versa. When we've had a long rest and we come up to the big bad, now our real glass cannons can just wreck the floor. So I think it depends on how your DM approaches it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that there should be parity. I mean, I don't think there should be. I think it's more interesting that there are classes that favor a short rest. But I think there is sometimes a very wide difference, and it can be. I can see how the original poster might be having an issue, especially if they only play their game one way.
Yeah.
In terms of rest, and
I agree with that.
Could be a source of frustration.
Yeah, and I agree with Steve's point. I think the more options you can give other classes, probably the better. So it feels like not really a rework for the Warlock, just kind of little tweaks here and there like they've been doing. I think the Warlock class is going to be just fine. Hopefully, Withering Aurora, that gives you an idea of what we think on it. But for us, that's going to do it for us this week. Remember, if you want to send in your questions or anything you find on the internet, you can send them to questions@potomacripg.com. If you'd like to support the Potomac RPG podcast, you can find us on coffee.com/PotomacRPG. And lastly, you can follow us at Potomac_RPG on Twitter and at Potomac RPG, all one word, on Instagram and YouTube. Thanks for being on today, Matt and Steve. Really appreciate it. Thank you to the rest of the Potomac RPG crew and, of course, all of our wonderful listeners out there. So for the Potomac RPG podcast, I'm Adam.
I'm Matt.
And I'm Steve.
Until next time, keep those dice rolling, keep those stories coming, and
never
stop
pledging to your evil patron. Glorious, what are you doing, my son? I'm so nervous.